Nature Works podcast. Conversations with extraordinary guests who are working to protect, regenerate, and better understand the natural world. With your host, Mike Weeks.
Welcome to Nature Works podcast. In this week's episode, I'm speaking with Malaika Vaz, who, if you are a fan of National Geographic, you'll know that she is one of their famous Nat Geo explorers. She's also a filmmaker and presenter, and she's been directing and hosting films and TV series for media networks such as Nat Geo, Al Jazeera, Discovery Channel, BBC, and Animal Planet. And in this episode, we discuss filming in remote regions of the planet, going undercover with criminal syndicates in the illegal fish markets, and more broadly, documentary making as a force for change. If you enjoy this episode and others, please share with folks who care about the natural world. Nature Works podcast always aims to provide honest and unbiased insights into how we can protect, restore, and regenerate our only living planet. We'll only protect what we care about, and these conversations hopefully incite respect, maybe even awe, and we hope a little love for the only place that you've got to live on in this vast, spinning universe. What listeners or viewers of this won't know is that you've just very kindly moved from one room to the other because of sound issues, but you've moved immediately into a room with a wall of photos of animals behind you, and I'm assuming those have something to do with your work as a wildlife filmmaker. Is that right?
Yeah, so some of these photographs that you see behind me are actually screen grabs from videos that we filmed in different parts of the world. So you can see a turtle from the Maldives, a tiger from the forests of central India. We've got an Asiatic lion right here. And it's just nice to have a little bit of wildness in our office at my production company, just to remind us of what we're in this for.
It's a wonderful opening frame for my line of questioning on this podcast, because I've read articles about you online, and especially the one on National Geographic, and I had to double check that you were actually 25, because you've seemingly lived the life of a 50-year-old so far, or rather you've packed more in than most 50-year-olds will have done. I'm quite amazed actually by the fact that you've made the films that you have, whilst also being so directly active in illegal wildlife trade, cessation, human and wildlife conflict, etc. But you're also a Cessna pilot, a competitive windsurfer, and an endurance horse rider. As a girl growing up, you grew up in Goa, right?
I did. I mean, I don't do any sport competitively. I used to win surf, in races and stuff, and now I windsurf for fun. I ride horses for fun. I climb mountains because I love it. I've always loved being outdoors, and that's kind of how I got started with filmmaking as well, because I started diving when I was 12, and I was seeing all of these incredible things underwater, and when you get back home after a dive, communicating them in just words just falls short, and I thought that the visual medium was a great way to tell stories about the places that I was falling in love with. But I guess more importantly, yes, I'm driven by a sense of adrenaline, but I think that one of the reasons I wanted to be a wildlife filmmaker is because for my generation of people living on this planet today, we cannot afford to be telling stories that are just about beautiful places. We need to be able to communicate complexity and what's happening to the natural world and what those incredible solutions look like.
Yeah, I am probably the greatest fanboy of Sir David Attenborough. And anyone listening to this podcast will know that I mention two people when I'm talking about heroes. One is Yvon Chouinard, who is the founder and owner of Patagonia, and you may have seen he's just recently given it away.
Super exciting.
I've been talking about Patagonia and been a loyal fan of theirs for the last 25 years. And the other is David Attenborough. And Yvon Chouinard is famous for saying you won't ever protect what you don't love. And Sir David Attenborough obviously has had the effect of bringing the natural world into the homes of hundreds of millions, maybe billions. I don't know what the reach of his shows are, but I would imagine it's 1 billion or more. And it's exactly what you're pointing at there, that the necessity to actually share the beauty and the wonder to all the people who don't have access, right? The majority of humans live in cities or live in urban areas where they're never going to be able to see the animals and the creatures and the ecosystems that they're directly impacting with their choices every day. And so you're doing I suspect you do it because you enjoy it as well, but you're doing a public service on you're doing a planetary service by making these films. On that, let's start there, because so I've worked in film and TV, worked for a number of years in television in the UK, made a couple of really successful series, and they were in the outdoors and the likes. Unfortunately, not as not designed to be as impactful as your content is. Mine were more for entertainment back in the day. But I know just how unbelievably difficult it is to string together compelling stories that rise above the noise. There's millions of wannabe filmmakers out there, and there's an endless amount of content being made and going on YouTube and the likes, as we see. But you've already made critically acclaimed documentaries, one of which am I right in saying one was is Oscar nominated, The Peng You Sai? Is that right?
Green Oscar nominated.
Sorry?
Green Oscar nominated.
Green Oscar nominated, yeah. Sorry, yeah, absolutely right. So how, you're 25 years old, you're a young woman who's traveling around the world when she's not windsurfing or flying Cessnas. How have you learned this craft of being able to make such impactful documentaries? Because it's incredibly difficult.
Well, I want to dig into something that you said a little bit earlier when you were talking about your own storytelling, and that's the usage of the word entertaining. I genuinely believe that we need more entertaining programming, because if something is impactful, but if it doesn't entertain you and it doesn't draw you in with the visuals and with the storytelling, then you are going to flip channels. And that's something that my team and I are definitely very cognizant of. We're constantly thinking about that. How do you tell difficult stories in ways that are interesting for global audiences? And what we've realized is that you have to have that common thread of humanity, and you cannot remove the humanity and the human story from the natural story. I am a big fan of David Attenborough as well, and so much of his work. And I think especially more so now in the last few years as he's evolved and started telling stories about conservation issues. But I still do think that in traditional media, we don't often talk about the communities that are at the front lines. They're unfortunately at the front lines of conservation, but they're never on the front pages of newspapers. They're never on mainstream television. And that's something that I really care about. So in the programming that we make, we want to keep it entertaining. We want to reach out to audiences all across the world, but we want to keep the communities, the people who are most impacted by environmental change, front and center, whether that is people we're reaching out to through global broadcast, or whether that is the people that we actively choose to have on screen as protagonists in our stories. And I mean, I've always known that I wanted to be a wildlife filmmaker. I have a notebook somewhere where it says that I want to be a wildlife anchor when I was about 5 or 6 or something like that. I didn't know the terms back then, but Steve Irwin was actually my hero more than David Attenborough. He was this, exciting guy who was doing crazy things, and I wanted to be like him when I was little. I now see how, my style of storytelling is very different, but I do think that entertainment at its core can draw people in, and that's when you hit them with the messaging. That's when you hit them with what they can actually do to change things in a tangible way.
So I love talking about documentary making as it pertains to wildlife and conservation and environmentalism. I've said on a number of occasions previously with wildlife cameramen and the likes that they're living the life that I wanted to live, because if I was to reboot my current life trajectory, it would be working pretty much in what you're doing right now. I love working with camera crews and the likes, but I also know how incredibly difficult it is for people listening in to this podcast and who will know undoubtedly, even just hearing you for a few minutes, will want to watch your work online, and we'll put all the links obviously to that later on in the show notes. Can you explain the process of how you go about defining an idea, validating it that it's going to be entertaining enough, and then from from step one of coming up with a concept to ending up saying going in the editing and then finally saying the film is ready? And take your time through it, because I think it's really fascinating for people who don't know the process.
I often say that, and I have no experience with having babies, but it does feel like giving birth to something, because you start really small, you have an idea, and by the time you're done with the edit, it feels like that film or that project has become a part of you, and it's very much something that you will always take with you wherever you go in life. And when a film comes out, I think it's exciting and it's amazing to see it on television and to have it appreciated in festivals and to see it go into the minds of people literally. But what I really like is the process, the hard work that goes into making the film, and especially the collaborative approach to filmmaking that our industry has. You have to work with people who are talented in difficult conditions, sometimes in the middle of in a jungle somewhere, on a mountain, in the ocean. There are difficult days, not just in terms of the hostile terrain that you're navigating, but also in terms of, did we get the story, or what the story that we initially imagined before we got onto the location, is that really as impactful as we thought it was? So there are all of these complex ideas that you're constantly wrestling with. But having an amazing team really makes it easier. And I'm lucky that I've been working with many incredible cinematographers, DOPs, sound recorders, directors, presenters, writers, producers. And I think all of us really are focused on creating impactful programming. And I think that's what is super exciting. So, once we've identified a subject, and that's often, based on what's contextually relevant, like say during coronavirus, and, 2020 hit us in the face with COVID. We told a story about bat conservation and zoonotic diseases because it was contextually relevant to global audiences at that point. And it was for Al Jazeera. Or before that, we worked in a film about wildlife trafficking, just because I happened to come across some wildlife trafficking that hadn't been reported. So that was an example of an unplanned story just popping up. But very often, I think, to be able to be a filmmaker or a storyteller, you have to be really well-read, and you have to constantly be engaging with the world around you, not just with the world of wildlife and conservation, but I'm constantly reading about technology and politics, because honestly, it's all linked. And really, I think through that process of deep diving into the world around you constantly, you get ideas and seeds of inspiration. So once that seed of inspiration, comes into our heads, or once we have a network often reaching out to us with an idea, because it's not always our idea. Sometimes it's ideas that television networks already have and they need a production company to make it for them. Or sometimes they have a show and they need ideas and then they reach out to us. Or sometimes we have an idea that we can't wait to tell. And then we reach out and we pitch these ideas to television networks. But once that process has kind of started, the first question I always ask is, what is my impact goal? And that is a really good starting point, because I can clearly outline what kind of change I want to make with the documentary. It really depends depending on different projects. We worked on a film series called Planet Defenders for the BBC Natural History Unit, and that was focused on telling conservation stories to younger audiences. So when we started out making this film about elephant tourism and its links to trafficking, the first question was, what is my impact goal? And the answer was that I want to make sure that the kids who watch the show go back home to their families and say, hey, the next time we're on holiday, let's not go ride an elephant. Let's not go pet a tiger. Let's not interact with animals in imposing and extractive ways. And I guess in the way that we designed the programming, we had that question in our mind the entire time. We were thinking about our audience, we were thinking about that goal. And the exciting thing was that when the film finally came out, we had kids reaching out to us from different parts of the world saying that, hey, we watched the film and there's no way I'm riding an elephant again. And I'm so glad that I actually understand that these are wild animals and they're not just born in captivity out of nowhere. So I think that's the benefit of asking that question of what is your impact goal? And then, of course, once you've asked that question, you've written down the initial script, you go out into the field with tons of bags of equipment. And you have to be nice to the airport guys so that they let you through.
Yeah, it's true. Yep.
Yesterday I had like some 15 bags coming back from Bangladesh to India after a shoot. And the guy was like, "Are you a filmmaker? What are you smuggling?" And he was just joking about it. But that's sometimes what it's like. You're carrying tons of bags to tell the story because visuals matter. But you go into the shoot and you have this idea of the story. And what I find really interesting personally, Mike, is the fact that that story changes with factual programming. The story sometimes completely changes, or it gets tweaked, and you have additional insight added to that because you're working with local collaborators and communities and scientists, and they have their own perspectives that can make your story so much richer. And that comes back to the idea of the collaborative process, right? You have different ideas to make better films for better impact goals. And then finally, once the film is shot, you come back home and you start editing it. And I think that's a really exciting process as well, to be holed up inside of a room with lots of coffee, looking at tons of footage, hours and hours of footage, and then condensing it until it's a real story. And I think our editors are superheroes for being able to just cut away all of the excess content that we have and really bring out the diamonds that we have in the footage.
Yeah, many a poor movie has been absolutely saved in the edit. And I know I've spent hundreds of hours sat in edit suites. I don't know how to use the systems like the professional editors, but I've been sat there watching magic made in front of my eyes, which otherwise looked almost amateur in some cases. Yeah. So yeah, they're the most unsung heroes, the editors of the documentary and filmmaking world.
Absolutely.
So how many films have you made now, actual documentaries?
I think about 23 or 24, something like that. I've stopped counting. I used to count, but I've stopped counting now.
And seeing the stills behind you from various docus, you've obviously been around the world a whole bunch of times. Now, you're classified as a Nat Geo Explorer. That's right. Yep. Yeah, and I want to know what the criteria is to become one of those in a moment. But you've obviously been to some far-flung places. In the bio that I was reading about you, said that you went undercover in the seafood trade to find out what illegal products, or rather what illegal species, were being sold. And there was a hairy moment there because you were being watched by essentially the ringleaders, or I think it said the kingpins of that trade.
Well, government, which is even scarier.
It was the government.
Yes, it was the government that was surveilling us because we were, following difficult things in their country. So that can be really tricky. And I think, with investigative work, there's so much risk involved with it. But it's still honestly the most exciting thing. And it kind of comes back to my passion for that adrenaline kick. I really need to start going on a roller coaster every morning. So I stopped doing more dangerous shoots. But I think it does give you that sense of having a mission. And even when there are dangerous moments and difficult moments, you're driven by that mission of getting the story.
I know that the illegal fishing industry, which is worth many billions of dollars, obviously, the illegal, unregulated fishing, it's one of the most dangerous industries in the world. I mean, people get on board boats thinking they're going out to sea for 3 months and they're not allowed to come back for 2 years. It's actually... Yeah, there is a slave industry that happens in it, unbeknownst to the people who are being enticed on. They take their passports or their ID, and then they're out at sea for 2 or 3 years. Anyone who complains can end up overboard. And we know this from a whole host of investigators. It's also one of the most difficult industries to investigate because out there in the ocean, it's so vast, it's so... they can get away with it. They're unaccounted for or unaccountable in many cases. So I know it's an incredibly dangerous industry, and we've actually done analysis on it, both for here in Indonesia, for working with the Ministry of Fisheries. When you went undercover, what was the process there? Because surely by now, aren't you a bit recognizable? I mean, you've been in a whole bunch of documentaries. You're an attractive young woman who probably looks a bit out of place, walking around with seafood mafia in what I would imagine is less than pleasant surroundings. So how do you go about going undercover in such a situation?
Well, I have to say that it was easier when I started out. The other day I was going undercover and someone said to me, "I've watched your show." And I was like,
yeah. That's where you need to put a beard on, right? And then some bigger shoulders and make yourself look like a man or something.
Well, so I do dress up when I'm filming undercover. I do dress up as a seafood trader. I've got glasses with cameras embedded in them. We've got different kinds of hidden undercover cameras, and we keep constantly changing so that it's not, recognizable. And my team does a really good job of filming as well when we're in these situations. But it's really about understanding the story and the person that you're pretending to be. So when we were filming in these wildlife markets in Guangzhou and Hong Kong, I was pretending to be a seafood trader. So I didn't just have to learn about sharks and manta rays and, all the exotic animals out there, but I have to learn about smaller species and like their Chinese names. Like what do I say when I'm talking to a Chinese trader? And I think that process of research is often very intensive because you cannot make a mistake in these situations. You cannot, let's say you're actually a filmmaker. We have gotten into really, really close encounters where people have begun to figure out that we're filming. But I think if you're convincing, honestly, you can get it anywhere. So a couple of weeks back, I was filming for this documentary we're producing about environmental change and pollution. And we're focusing on fast fashion for the first half of the film. So I pretended to be a buyer of clothes in this big fast fashion company. And it was interesting because I went in there dressed up with cameras with the rest of my team and with a sales agent who also thought that we were actually buyers. So we placed a dummy order of t-shirts so that they just wouldn't, assume that we're filmmakers. But I think a lot went into that, whether that was recruiting the sales agent, whether that was, creating designs for clothes that we never needed to use, whether that was ordering those clothes, just so that we could get the information. And we got what we wanted. We were interviewing someone who was a former employee at a company that produces clothes for some of the biggest retailers in the world that I can't say yet until the film is released. But he basically said that these big retailers that all of us have bought from at some point are dumping huge amounts of toxic chemicals into the river. And they're turning the ETPs, the effluent treatment plants, on only when the foreign buyers come. So when outsiders come, that's when the ETP is turned on. So everyone thinks that it's perfect and it aids greenwashing efforts. But the rest of the year, it's business as usual, and the environment is being compromised at a massive scale just to produce clothes for the global, often Western market.
Do you have any concerns for the after effects when you expose a company, you expose a group of illegal wildlife traders or the likes? Obviously, these are people that probably have money, have influence, and in some cases are probably not the nicest people that you're likely to spend time around. Is there any extra emphasis that you have to take on your safety thereafter when these documentaries come out?
Well, there are some cities that I just know I can't go back to, and that's something that I've accepted. But I do think that when I was starting out, I made the mistake of often villainizing in subtle ways. It wasn't, we weren't obviously saying it, but villainizing the smaller players in the system, the small scale traffickers and the small scale fishermen who were illegally capturing different kinds of seafood, or the people who were trafficking, wildlife products into different parts of Asia. But I've realized now that, it is the big players in the system. And even if someone is killing 5 elephants, and it's terrible and it's a global syndicated industry, we often talk about that one poacher, but we don't take on the big industries. We don't take on the Shells of the world and the H&Ms of the world just because it's easier to blame the small player. So I'm much more concerned about the safety of the small players that I'm filming with than I am about my own safety, just because I know that when a film comes out, criminal systems are also watching those films. It's police that are watching those films in local ecosystems. And we just want to make sure that we're protecting people down the chain, down the supply chain. But when it comes to our personal safety, it's obviously a risk. And I think the people who choose to tell these stories kind of select themselves to be ready to tell these stories because we care so deeply about the issues. And often once you find out about a story, you can't not tell it. It's like, I know it's dangerous, I know it's a bad idea, but we have to tell it because there's no other way to expose what's happening. And yes, we do need to be telling stories about the beauty of the natural world. And so much of what my production company does is beautiful natural history documentaries that are so important today. But then the other half is our investigative feature documentary division, which creates films about complex environmental issues. And so often, because of systems that are in place, the only way to get these stories out is to go undercover or to, tell a story in investigative ways. Right now, actually, we're producing this film about migrant exploitation and its links to climate change. But with this film, we're working with a local presenter from Bangladesh who is a former migrant. And he is investigating how migrants are being impacted by rising sea levels and increased heat in their home countries and political instability that's driving them to, parts of the Gulf and other parts of the world where they are encountering, high temperatures and worker exploitation. So I think one thing that I've realized over time is that with a lot of these investigative documentaries, it's not only environmental issues, it's often environmental issues and human rights issues that collide. And it's important to tell both sides of the story. Obviously, there's an environmental collateral, but what is the human collateral?
Yeah. So as you were explaining that, a number of people come to mind for me who I've met over my lifetime. I've been to a lot of developing countries. I spent a lot of time in Haiti as one place, which is one of the poorest places in the world, as you know. I spent over, nearly 6 months there over multiple trips. And in places where people are so utterly desperate to feed their children and to put food on the table or just survive another couple of days, in many cases, these people don't have the choice like we do as Westerners to be able to decide to eat organic, free-range meat. They have to eat monkey or endangered species because that's the only thing on the menu. And the majority of people who are most likely poachers or wildlife traffickers or the likes. Now, I know at the top of the chain, people are just making money and they're making buck. But at that bottom end, like you say, very difficult, isn't it, to judge people when they're surviving in a resource-starved environment, and all that's available is what we're telling them in the West, because we have maybe more insight onto what it is to have endangered species, or how, on a global view, we need to be protecting every species against extinction. But that's a very privileged position to be telling people that you can eat. We eat pig and we eat cow and I eat cow. You probably don't. We eat all of these, but you're not allowed to eat monkey, or you're not allowed to eat, or you're not allowed to kill a tiger and make money from it and sell it to the Chinese for whatever aphrodisiac they believe that it's worthwhile. It's a very fine balance. And you come from you're from India. You come from a developing country. I mean, I had the privilege of growing up in the UK, so you've seen a lot more of the effects of poverty than most people in the West will ever see. Do you have a sort of rule of thumb of how you get those narratives across? Because you're obviously wanting to impact people's thinking around how important it is to preserve and protect, but people are important as well, right? And just to finish there, I mean, one of the issues I see with the environmental movement, and I consider myself an unintended environmentalist. I'm an environmentalist because I have 2 young children, sons who I want to inherit a world that I had the privilege of experiencing in my youth, which is one rich in wildlife and beautiful places and clean oceans. And so I do it as much for them as I do it for the natural world itself. But one thing that I'm not comfortable with in a lot of the environmental narratives is is the sort of anti-human approach, where humans are this scourge on the planet, and that if we can depopulate in some shape or form, as long as it's obviously not privileged Westerners who are depopulated, as long as we depopulate in developing countries, over there, then everything will be okay, because we'll bring populations down and then animals can thrive, and it's it's one that I'm not particularly comfortable with, because I like people on the whole, you know, and I don't want to be in that depopulation program, and neither do you, and neither does anyone with any sense that I've ever met. They want to bring their families up and be in their communities and be safe and be without friction and conflict, unless you're an arms dealer, and then you want as much conflict as possible. So that's a sort of my view, that I'm interested on how you balance those kind of narratives between also showing the natural world's necessity for survival.
I've been thinking about this a lot recently, because I think we're all the product of the narratives that we grew up watching and listening to. And this whole population narrative is, I think, at its core, deeply racist. This idea that, you know, it is the global south that is developing and having too many babies and polluting is something that is so deeply entrenched that people from the global south, including me, have often believed it. And so I am producing this documentary with my team about pollution. And initially, the first 3 countries that I chose were India, Bangladesh, and Mongolia, 3 countries in Asia. And then I began to think about it more, and I realized that, hey, this is, you know, perpetuating a problem that I obviously see at this point. So now we've shifted to telling one part of the story in Bangladesh, but then the other 2 parts in North America, because I think that is where a lot of the locus of power exists, and that's also where a lot of the pollution comes from, right? But we're not often talking about it because it's not, you know, squatters who are polluting, but it's big industrial machines that are polluting, and it's the industry that is really working closely with government to continue polluting and damaging environments that are often populated by people of color and people who are vulnerable. So I think that we need to really, really reframe these conversations, and reframe them by saying that, hey, obviously it is a collective problem and we have a collective responsibility, but there are some reparations to be paid environmentally, and we do need the big countries all across the world, the hegemonic powers that we see, we need them to step up a little bit more and to contribute to reducing environmental catastrophe in countries that have not contributed to emissions. Like, for example, my neighboring country, Pakistan, has been dealing with crazy amounts of flooding and heat waves. And India, of course, is also really, really vulnerable to climate change, even though the emissions from this side of the world haven't been historically as high as parts of the West. So I think that narrative definitely needs to change. And I'm a big proponent of having industry-driven solutions and really putting the onus on industry when it comes to innovation, because there is no way that we can regress. Communities across the world will not be able to stop using their smartphones and not driving cars and, you know, going back to being hunter-gatherers. It's not going to happen. And at the same time, we have this 8 billion people, a growing population of people all across the world that have infinite aspirations, and the environment needs those aspirations to be condensed, and the economy needs them to be expanded. So there's an inherent contradiction there. And the only way that I see that we're going to get out of this is by investing in the green sector, by investing in renewable energy, in regenerative industries, in regenerative agriculture, and really being inspired by the indigenous communities across the world who have lived in coexistence with the natural world. And many of our documentaries at Untamed Planet have focused on these communities, and they really, really inspire me. They don't not take from the land. They're definitely taking from the land on a daily basis, but they're conscious of the fact that they need to leave enough for their future generations, and they need to take enough, and they need to give back enough. And I think for us as modern day human beings living in cities, giving back means investing in the green sector. And right now, so much investment that we see in the nonprofit world goes to other causes, which are really important, but so little goes to nature-based solutions and tech-based solutions. And our industry often operates in these absolutes of, you know, we've got to invest in nature-based solutions, or we've got to use, you know, climate tech. I think we need everything. We need every toolkit that we have out there. And we need to have every kind of innovation out there to combat the climate crisis, because we're already at that point. Yeah,
well, you're speaking to the converted, obviously, because the company that I'm a major player in, we have 2 activities. One is a very highly sophisticated environmental intelligence platform, which enables us to actually know what's going on in the environment, from ocean acidification to coral reef degeneration or regeneration to fish stocks to land-based issues like pest control on farms, of species management, carbon sequestration and the likes. So that's our tech play. And then we've also, over the last 3 years, put an inordinate amount of time and effort and resources into bioregenerative agriculture, because I think the pretty much confirmed numbers are about 30% of greenhouse gases come from the agricultural industry globally. And that's not hard to believe, especially right now here in Bali, because it's rice straw burning season, meaning that they've harvested the rice and then they don't actually have any idea on how to compost, because they've never been taught how to compost rice straw, so all of it gets burned. And I know that's a major issue, but where you are as well in India. And I know that for a fact, because every time I look for new research papers on novel ways of cleaning industrial effluents or waste spills using plants, or looking at composting rice straw in novel ways, or composting certain materials, I typically always find a paper from India. And it seems that there is quite some I don't know if it's a renaissance, but or whether it's been going on for a long time, but there seems to be quite a lot of universities and interested parties in restoring the land and restoring the environment using quite traditional and regenerative practices. We use here on our farm, so we have a small farm here, NatureWorks Farm. It's recovered rice paddy fields that we've taken on custodians of, and we're doing it in different phases. We're doing an acre at a time, because we're training up local farmers who don't have any idea in organic farming, and we're retraining them. And that in itself is a challenge, because the regenerative approach is very knowledge intensive, and the monoculture with rice farming is you can be a robot and do it. You know, you just throw fertilizer and spray pesticide and the likes. But we have a plant that I'm mildly obsessed by, and we've put 5,000 of them over the property so far. We'll probably do another 5 or 10, and that's vetiver, and that's an Indian it's an Indian grass. And the only reason I know about vetiver is because I was researching ways to clean pollutants up, and I found 3 or 4 papers out of different Indian universities showing how they had cleaned up sewage and wastewater, and in villages where they'd planted it and the likes. And so I have this mixed view of India, of it being one. I was there about 15-16 years ago for 3 weeks. I was filming, actually. I was in a place called, you may not have even heard of it, because every Indian I've ever mentioned it to has looked at me blankly, and it's called Kolhapur, and it was about
it's called Kanpur.
Kolhapur, yeah. I'm probably pronouncing it terribly wrong, and it was north of Mumbai, and by about 15 hours, often on the wrong side of the road. In the Land Rover that we were in, there was floods on some of the motorways, so we went over onto the other motorway, which nobody seemed to mind. But I did kushti wrestling in the home of it. Yes,
I am impressed. I'm very impressed. That takes something.
I spent a week in a kushti wrestling retreat or training area with all of these about 80 grown men, all wearing loincloths, rolling in the mud. Not one of them spoke a word of English. And then I wrestled along with my friend on that show, Jack Osborne, who's the son of Ozzy Osbourne, you know, the famous singer. We then wrestled in the mud in front of about 15,000 screaming Indian locals, who luckily probably none of them bet on the white boys to win, because we got thrashed. Anyway, so I've spent a few weeks in India and seen the chaos and the wonder and the awe and the clash of beliefs and there's nowhere else like it on earth. But I have this kind of sense of India actually having even though it's this massively developing, and of course everyone wants cars and everyone wants stuff and everyone has the right to have that, by the way, absolutely. But there also seems to be quite a deep sense of understanding of how important it is to be restoring nature and protecting it. And I wonder whether that comes from the kind of spiritual and religious beliefs that are so inherent in the country, or whether is there a scientific renaissance. I have here, I want to ask about India. It's your home, and it's one of the largest developing economies in the world, and it can either make us or break us, along with China. What's the lay of the land?
Well, to answer your question, of course, spiritually we believed in nature and its power, but I also think that we're a country of incredibly talented, intelligent, and driven people, and that's why we have so much innovation coming out of India. Whether that is scientific innovation, whether that is technology, whether that is having our forest departments conserving wildlife. I think India has done an incredible job in so many ways. And when it comes to biodiversity, I'm really proud of the fact that we still have so many different kinds of big charismatic megafauna. That's not the case in different parts of the world. If you look at America, for example, so much of the big biodiversity has just been killed off or hunted, whereas we still have tigers, and the tiger numbers are on the rise, right? And of course, there are challenges, and we've got cheetahs coming in. I don't know how I feel about that just yet, but we have a lot of conservation challenges, and there's obviously a big struggle with industry often and with permissions to destroy forests. But I think on the whole, in many ways, I'm inspired by my country's commitment to conserving nature and to conserving the natural world. And I do believe that in the areas where we fall short, whether it is in the energy sector, whether it is with our resource consumption, or whether it is with biodiversity extinction, hopefully it is that very strong core scientific integrity and tech and innovation and just good governance as well in many parts of the country that will come up and will solve those problems. So I'm definitely very optimistic, but I also do think that it's important for us to embrace the green sector. In many parts of the global south, we often talk about how the West has had its time in the sun to pollute, and it's polluted for the longest time, and now it's our time. And I think that's a deeply problematic narrative. We are in this together, and I think there's also a huge economic advantage of getting on the green energy bandwagon fast, because then we're in control, we're independent, we can depend on ourselves. So rather than saying that, hey, we're going to pollute in extractive ways for the next 30 years because, you guys have done it already, I think it's important for us, and we're doing this in many, many ways, to say this is the time to invest in indigenous green technology and indigenous solutions, in locally developed conservation management protocols and solutions, just because then we're going to be leaders in this ecosystem. So yes, I am all for a world of collaboration, but I think a good amount of healthy competition between countries in this green race to the top is important, just as we've been competing in the race to the bottom.
Yeah, I see that here in Indonesia, obviously. Mm-hmm. We've got a population of 290 or so million people, and there's now a burgeoning middle class. That comes with its own problems, but it's also, I've spoken to my friends who've been here 40 and 50 years, respectively, and they delight at the fact that they've seen in their lifetimes, as Americans who've lived here this long, people being able to send their kids to really good schools, and people being able to afford really safe and comfortable homes, and the same people being able to get access to really good medical care and all of that stuff that should be on some level basic human rights. And of course they're doing that at the expense of the environment, because being human and on the planet is at the expense of the environment, no matter what we do, unless we just become monks and start or nuns or the equivalent, and sitting and breathing in fresh air and running off of sunlight, and none of us are going to be doing that. But there is also here a huge amount of attention now going into how can they be more sustainable and ecologically sound, especially here in Bali, where the governor wants to turn the whole island organic in the next 3 years. Everything. Just wants to do away with chemical farming, which is really exciting for me because this is my home long term. Yeah. So where do you see the most impact being made in a country of, what is it, 1.1 billion people in India, something like that, isn't it? Billion people. Yeah.
I think that we've had a lot of.
It's all right. I picked that one up.
Can we take a break and just, just go talk about that?
Yeah. I'll pause. It's quite funny that you left me on with a.
I got the drilling to stop.
But over your right shoulder, there are kangaroos mating. Not
kangaroos.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, those are wild dogs. They're called toad.
Oh, I couldn't. From here, I can't figure. I was thinking that looks like kangaroos having a really good time.
Well, they are mating, and they're also both. I think they're both male. They're just kids playing. They're young.
They're Indian wild dogs, are they? Or
yes, they are.
Yeah.
They're in the forests of Kabini in the Western Ghats, where we were filming them recently. So we spent about a month following a pack of these wild dogs through the forest, and it's incredible because they are literally smaller than my Labrador at home, but they can, the pack together can take down a deer in no time.
I didn't realize they were wild. So these aren't feral dogs. These are an actual wild species, like a wolf.
Endangered wild species that you find inside the forest. They're harder to see than tigers in some parts of the country.
So are you spending weeks at a time living in the wilds, so to speak?
Very often. So the way that, we do things at my company is that we have two different divisions. One half of our team is often filming natural history documentaries and environmental films. And then the other half is doing more investigative content, some human rights films. We often do branded content here and there, but really our two main focus areas are producing natural history, blue chip films and series and contributing to global projects, and then producing films about environmental issues and human rights issues.
And which of those do you feel most passionate about? Is there a...
I can't choose. I feel like there are two parts of who I am. And honestly, I don't think I could do one without the other, right? Because I think the weeks in the forest or in the ocean diving with animals like sharks or hanging out with elephants, it's those moments that refresh my soul, that make me truly, truly happy. And that's, honestly, that's my zone. And I think for our team as well, it's super, super exciting to be out there in the forest telling these stories. And then the other half is stories that we just have to tell. And it's a very different kind of excitement because we have this mission. It often feels like at the beginning of the shoot, we've set ourselves out on a path that's almost impossible and we're not going to get the story. That's what I thought 10 days back. But we put in 100% and, the story slowly begins to come together. And I think that process of finding the story, capturing it, and communicating these complex environmental issues is really exciting. And then the natural history is what we go to after and, tell stories about beautiful places and beautiful ecosystems.
And those natural history films that you've made, where are the most remote regions that you've been to? Like you just said, you spent a month following these wild dogs. I'm imagining you in the forests and getting eaten alive by mosquitoes and having to sleep in hammocks and the likes. Or are you doing a Bear Grylls and filming that and then staying in a 5-star hotel down the road?
That's a very good question. So with the natural history shoots, we often have to be in hotels because you need to charge your cameras, you need to make sure that you're processing the data. So we're not filming the crazy, adventures that we have and then actually staying in a 5-star hotel. We're just, filming natural history, so only animals for those shows. And then we do a lot of presenter-based shows where I'm often in the jungle. And I think with some of those presenter-based shows, it's genuinely really hard and we're living on the land, camping out in the middle of nowhere. We recently were filming in Kashmir, and we were in a hide for many days. And then we hiked all the way up this mountain to film these marmots. And it took quite a while to get up the mountain. We could see helicopters hovering above from, neighboring countries at some point. And it was really an adventure. And at one point we ran out of supplies because, we were hungrier than we assumed we would be. So we had to pay someone to come all the way up the mountain with more biscuits and fruit for the rest of us. But, when we have these wild shoots, it's often really exciting because you have to be on your guard the entire time because there's wild animals around. So your senses are almost more alert in a prehistoric way. Like, it reminds me of early man and woman, because you're constantly thinking about, where you are, whether there's, great sources of food around, where the next water source is, whether there's a safe camping ground. And recently, when I was filming for this project that we're doing, I was in the forest and I got chased by a bear, and it just came out of nowhere, and I wasn't expecting it. But thankfully, I realized that I have this incredible ability to scream very, very loud.
I wondered what was coming next from that.
I have never had to practice it in my life, thankfully, but that bear really tested it, and I was able to get out unscathed.
What kind of bear was it?
It was a Himalayan black bear.
And how big do they grow? Don't tell me this thing's the size of a small weasel.
I mean, it's the size of a human being when it's standing up on 2 feet, right? These are big animals, and their instinctive response to conflict is to claw your face out. So often people die, but they claw people's faces out. So it's really gory, and it's really difficult for the communities that live there that have apple orchards, because these bears want a quick snack, and they don't have a 7-Eleven, so they hop down to the neighboring orchard, and that's where a lot of conflict happens. So for us, we're just popping in and we're having these adventures and getting out there, but for the communities, it's a constant, unglamorous battle.
So is that the documentary that you made about human-animal conflict?
Well, so this film is actually a natural history film. We're doing a natural history and presenter, so I'm on camera talking about animals, and it's about the adventure as well. And it's an expedition in Kashmir, and there's bears and there's hangul, which is a critically endangered deer. There's about 250 of them left in the wild, and all these different other species. So we're doing like an exciting broadcast version. But what I find personally really fulfilling is that we're also doing a virtual reality film, which is directed by my co-founder, Nitya Sood. And it's basically a film that will reach out to the local communities, because this is a conflict zone. Kashmir is at the India-Pakistan border, and it's a contentious place politically. So a lot of people just don't have access to the wild. They're constantly in lockdowns, not COVID lockdowns, but political lockdowns. They don't get to step outside of their homes very often for long periods of time. And many people just don't have a television. So the only way to reach out to these communities is through exciting, emerging new technology like virtual reality. So besides the broadcast version that will probably find its way on a major network, we're also doing a shorter version, which is about wildlife. And it's, when we did the first draft, we showed it to a couple of community members, and they put the headset on, and they saw this animal that they'd only heard about through reports on television for the first time, and they felt like they were there. And the sense of awe and wonder from everyone from 5-year-olds to grandmas and grandpas was just really, really heartwarming, I think. And that's what makes it special, to be able to genuinely reach out to communities. And it has to be intentional. The reason I say intentional is because you can't just make a film and assume that it's going to go out to everyone. Yes, we have the privilege of working with networks like National Geographic, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Discovery, and those reach out to millions and millions of people, and I'm so grateful for that platform. But in rural areas, I think, things like virtual reality can really make a difference.
Well, so you're a Nat Geo Explorer. What's the criteria for being declared a Nat Geo Explorer? Do you have to have done a certain amount of miles, or made a certain amount of movies, or been chased by a certain amount of bears?
Well, I guess National Geographic Explorers around the world are people who have a passion for exploration and for telling stories that can make a difference, and for doing research that can make a difference. So it's an application form. Anyone in the world can be a National Geographic Explorer. I think it's competitive. I don't know what that's like, but it's an incredible community. And I became a National Geographic Explorer about 6 years back. And it's just the most inspiring community of explorers. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. recently at the National Geographic Explorers Festival, and I was hanging out with someone who literally was, part of the discovery of the Titanic. And there was Sylvia Earle there, who's been doing incredible work with ocean conservation. And Jane Goodall is a National Geographic Explorer as well. And there are all of these incredible younger explorers as well from different parts of the world who are doing pioneering work. And what's exciting is that there's scientists, there's archaeologists, there's geologists, there's filmmakers, photographers, and we're all in love with the natural world and a bit crazy about what we do. So it's a great place to meet other people who you can collaborate with, to work with on projects. And I'm just really grateful that National Geographic Society and National Geographic Partners has invested in so much of the work that I do, because they've taken risks. They've invested in films that are often difficult to make. You know, we don't know whether we'll get the story. It's something that's difficult to capture. But I think they're driven by a sense of, you know, supporting people who want to make a difference in the world. And I just feel really grateful for that platform and for that opportunity.
And yeah, I mean, it must be quite something to have that above your door and that Geo Explorer. I quite like that, actually. Mine would say Local Bali Explorer.
It happens to be a flag at the office.
Look at that. Where I hope you fly that every major mountain that you climb to the top of. Where do the majority of your films get seen? Are you talking to an Indian audience? Are you talking to an Asian audience, or US, or?
Well, so global audiences, last I checked, I mean, over 170 countries, that's where our films have played. So many, many places across the world. We've had our films on National Geographic, on Discovery, on the BBC, Al Jazeera, and other platforms as well. But I think we started out as an Indian production company making films for an Indian audience, and we moved on to an Asia audience. Now we're telling stories for global audiences. And it's exciting because so often, so much of the media power is concentrated in the West, in places like Bristol and New York. And it's really exciting for us as a company to be based out of India and also the US, because we do a lot of work in the United States, and we've been based out of New York as well for the last year, to be able to tell stories about India and about Asia and about the world to global audiences. So I think that's exciting. And I think we need to be having more diverse storytelling in terms of the voices represented on global television. We need to have more local people telling their stories, and we need to create a world where you can have someone from Bristol going to Africa and telling stories about Africa just as much as you can have someone from Africa going to Bristol and telling stories about the wild there. That's the world I think we need.
Well, you know, you're currently being interviewed by someone from Bristol, don't you?
I can tell.
That's my hometown. I grew up in Bristol. Yeah? Yes. And in fact, I am fourth generation Bristolian. So
wow.
Yeah, if you cut me through the middle, it says it like a stick of sticky rock. I don't know if you know that.
I love Bristol. It's a great city, and I think I have quite a few friends there. And the wildlife film industry is based out of this. It's a great place to be from. Yeah,
it's a wonderful place. And actually, I feel very fortunate that my love of nature was actually born out of growing up in that city. And I grew up in the suburbs, in a very poor part of the city, but surrounded by woodlands and parks. And my escape from a less than happy childhood was just nature and going into the local woods. I was drawing kingfishers that very few people even knew existed in the local stream system. 7, 8 years old, drawing those and going to the local library and getting bird books out. And I knew where bearded tit nests were, and they were a very, very rare species at that time. I found a crested newt in our local pond, which was on the endangered species list in the UK. You know, it's always because it's surrounded by hills, and I think that's had a lot of influence on people there, because it's a very green city. You know, unlike London, where you get very specific parks, you're actually surrounded by woodlands and a wide open countryside. So yeah, it's a very special place. But I have that here in Bali as well. Of course, I live here. Our office right here is smack in the middle of Balinese rice farming communities.
Oh, wow.
So we wake up.
Very beautiful places, I have to say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was in Boulder, Colorado before I came here, and that's arguably the most beautiful place I've ever lived in my life. Yeah. I can't live in cities now because I'm just so accustomed to walking out my door and hearing the birds, or hearing the crickets when I go to sleep, and you know that becomes something of an addiction. So, what are you working on now? What's the main projects that you're engaged in?
I just realized something, a little correction. When I was talking about Bristol and Africa earlier, I said Bristol, which is a city, and then Africa, which is a continent. And I think that's something that
I didn't pick up on that. But you're right. Yeah, I'm glad you caught that. Well done.
And very often think about this, continents as like monoliths that are uniforms. So I should probably say Tanzania or, a city like Durban and Bristol as opposed to Bristol in Africa. But that's just calling me out and calling myself out. And I think, as a storyteller, we're constantly evolving and getting better and trying to tell more representative stories, trying to change narratives. So I'm super excited about feedback and criticism when it comes from our audiences as well. When we put out a film, 90% of people say they love it, and the 10% is like, what is this? Or, that didn't work out. And I think that feedback that we get from that criticism is also really important in, propelling ourselves forwards without me going off in another path. What are we working on right now? We're working on...
I just interrupt you there a second though, because you bring up a really good point. And I think, and forgive me, I don't mean this to sound condescending, and I'm an old man, I'm about to turn 48 soon, but for the majority of 25-year-olds that I encounter, they actually want a much softer landing when in their careers, and they're not looking for feedback and they're not looking for criticism. And I saw actually in the Nat Geo interview with you, or the profile on you, that you actually changed one of your documentaries based on the fact that some of it wasn't accurate enough. And I thought that was actually a really, a very commendable thing to do, because I've worked in TV, as you know, and you spend so much money capturing footage over a period of time. To actually go back and refilm it and do it again is a big cost to the production budgets. So that's incredibly commendable, and I think that speaks mountains to your own ethics and values. So yeah, don't just gloss over that one. And look, I missed Bristol and Africa, and I know Africa's a continent, but Bristol is the centre of the known universe. So it's okay. It's what.
My audience, but I also think that the reason we changed that, it didn't require a crazy amount of effort, because we usually do work with collaborators before and make sure that we have our facts correct. But in this particular case, it wasn't that we were not accurate, but because it was a community member that we filmed with who didn't feel like they were represented in their entirety. And I think, it is so important for us to represent communities who live alongside wildlife with as much precision and authenticity to who they believe themselves to be as we do with other subjects, right? So what we do typically at Untamed Planet is that once we create our film, we have a community advisor who we show the first draft of the film to, then obviously the final draft as well. But we show the first draft of the film to and we say, what do you think? And I think that input that we get is really valuable. And we need to really start seeing communities that we film with, not just as subjects, but as collaborators and often as producers of these stories.
So I was working in London at Ginger Productions, which was a relatively big-sized production company in the UK that were owned by a famous TV presenter called Chris Evans, although he'd already sold it and made £70 million by the time I started working there. And it was around the time when the scandal broke out over the Queen being misrepresented by the late Her Majesty, the Queen, when she was misrepresented by the BBC. And they'd filmed her storming down a corridor, and I think from memory they'd made out that she was impatient or angry, when in fact it was more the fact that she doesn't like being late for people, and she was being impatient to be on time because, of course, Her Majesty was rarely, if ever, late. What a lady. And I remember people working on the projects I was working on having a meeting and saying... Well, with this new sort of impetus and focus on factual entertainment, on the factual in factual entertainment, we're going to have to change some of these storylines that we've been working on. And so much of the alleged factual entertainment and documentary making has been, of course, just as very infactual, and poetic license has been applied in many, many ways. And I think one of the beautiful things about social media nowadays is that you can't really hide your BS. Companies who try and greenwash, documentary makers who try and tell inaccurate stories, companies that try and just make themselves look... It's just, now is the time of transparency. And I really appreciate that about... I'm not a great fan of social media. I think it disconnects us in many ways. But if it's done right, then it has many benefits. But that for me is one of those benefits. So nowadays, when I watch a documentary, I actually get more of a sense of it being legitimate than I did 10 years ago before Her Majesty's, issue with the BBC.
Yeah. I do think, though, that, this idea of objectivity, obviously, we have to try our 100% to tell stories in the most representative ways. But there's also something that I've been thinking about, which is that you're taking a massive, complex issue and you're condensing it into a 30-minute film. There is no way that you can represent every perspective out there. We are inherently human beings, flawed human beings with very strong opinions. I like to call myself someone with strong opinions that are loosely held. So I will change my opinions, but I do think that I influence the narrative of stories that I create. And everyone who works in a film influences that narrative. So I think true objectivity is impossible, even in factual programming. But I guess if you put an effort into the research process of figuring out how do we talk about climate change in a way that's equitable? How do we talk to communities? How do we get collaborators on screen who haven't traditionally been represented on television? When we put in that research, then you're setting yourself up for success, I guess. But we also have to allow for creators, for filmmakers, and photographers to make mistakes, because it's so hard to be perfect in this world. We're all going to mess up at some point. But as long as we keep bettering and keep trying to tell better stories and stories that can really create an impact, we're on the right path.
Humans are designed for stories. We're not actually designed overly for facts. We've the written word is so much more recent than the narrative that has been passed on around firesides and from father to son and grandfather to grandchildren and the likes over millennia. We're designed for stories, and actually, if you let too much, it's not about the factual, it's about framing it in a way that it's still compelling. Because if you just show a bunch of facts about the problems that you are facing, or we are facing, in your docus, people will switch off. And then there was no point in making it anyway, so it has to be compelling. So before I rudely interrupted you, but I did want to just sort of point out your ability to take feedback and take it on the chin is a commendable one. I'd asked you what you're working on now, and you were about to start telling me what the main focus is.
So we're working on a couple of projects. Some of them are in the natural history space, and my team is actually currently on shoot right now in a very beautiful forest while I'm at the office getting some writing done for the next few days. And I love the writing process, so I don't mind, but I'm a little bit jealous of the fact that they're around beautiful elephants today. So we're doing natural history stuff. We're also producing a couple of investigative documentaries, 3, and 1 conservation documentary and a short video series. So we've got our hands full. I can't, reveal more details yet because of all of the NDAs I'm wrapped up in. But I think, we've got some exciting programming up ahead that's going to be, on television and on digital platforms. And I'm just really excited to work with my team on developing these and getting these out into the universe.
And is your long-term view to continue to make documentaries and to make footage, or is it to move more into any other spheres of the environmental and conservation domains? Do you intend to be a politician at any point?
Well, I run a media company. That's what I do, and we produce documentaries. That's something that I want to do every single day for the rest of my life because I love making films. I can't imagine my life without the process of making films, the hard work, the payoffs, the failures, the successes, the energy on a shoot, the energy in the edit. I love every part of filmmaking and being in the wild and telling these stories. So I will be a filmmaker forever. But outside of my film work, I do a lot of work with environmental advocacy and policy. And I consult with nonprofit organizations and work on anti-trafficking campaigns. And I'm an ambassador for this initiative called the Global Peace Dividend Initiative that is actively nudging governments across the world to demilitarize and reinvest the surplus from that demilitarization process in the environment and in the green transition. So I don't like to define myself outside of the filmmaker. Like, yes, I'm a filmmaker, but everything else I think is fluid. I don't know what I'll be doing in 30 years, but I just want to keep creating things in the world, building businesses, telling important stories, and helping make the world a better place every day, just a tiny bit, and learning from my mistakes.
A couple more questions, just personal ones, and this is at my interest as much as for listeners. So both of your parents Indian?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you grew up in Goa, which is really known as a sort of party place amongst most Westerners, isn't it?
It is. It's definitely a party place. I mean, I grew up around the beach, and it's a fun place to grow up. Let's just say that. And right now, I'm based between Goa and New York City, which I think is just a really interesting contrast, because I get the beautiful ocean outside and forests. When I'm in New York, it's the hustle and bustle of one of the best places to be.
But wait, you're in Goa. You're in Goa now.
Yes, I am.
I didn't realise. I thought you were in some major city somewhere.
No, I just got back from Dhaka yesterday, and I'm in Goa for 3 days before Austria, and then I'm back on shoot, and then in New York again.
So, are your parents into? Are they conservationists, or are they scientists, or are they no? So this is completely different from the family line of business.
My family runs an alcoholic beverage company, and they're entrepreneurs, and they do. My mom's into real estate. She runs a real estate company. And I'm a filmmaker. I don't think they really like being outdoors that much. Like they're city people. They love the city. But I've increasingly been getting my brothers and my family to spend more time in the wild. And I think, it's growing on them. Let's say that.
So anytime you need a hip flask with whiskey, you know that your parents are able to provide it for...
It's funny, I don't drink, so I'm constantly sipping on coconut water or orange juice because I grew up around it. I guess it's my form of rebellion.
On I think it was last Friday, 3 or 4 days ago, I had an incredible young lady in here in the podcast room, also Indian, Shrina Karani, her name is, and she's a political activist in the US. She's 29, 4 years older than you. We went for lunch afterwards. And what completely blew me away was her eloquence and her ability to describe and define complex situations. And as I'm talking to you, and I'm wondering whether there's something going on in India that's turning out young women who are more eloquent and seemingly going after massive impact than most of the people that I've spoken to in the last year, because I'm deeply impressed by your efforts and what you're doing, especially the undercover stuff, because I know there's a huge amount of risk on that. If people want to, and I know they will, want to see your films and to know more about you, where do they go, and what would you say would be the best, the starting point? What if you've got all of a sudden fanboys like me wanting to watch everything, where do we start? Because if there's 21 or so documentaries, which one to start with and which one to end with?
Well, unfortunately, the thing is with documentaries for television is that they come out on television and they're not, all available.
Oh, no, we can't see them all.
Yeah, so the thing is, I would say follow Untamed Planet's website, follow me on Instagram, and I constantly post updates on projects that we're working on that are broadcast. But we also have some films that I think should be linked to on my company's website, which are still available on streaming platforms. And with some of the films that we're producing right now, actually, they will be available on streaming platforms. So I think that's an exciting thing. But yeah, hopefully this changes with broadcast one day, because it's an amazing opportunity to reach out to millions of people when you have something on television. But to have that, click of a finger accessibility of films, I think would be an amazing innovation. And I'm sure, I guess with Netflix you have that, and I guess with other broadcasting networks having their digital streamers, you have that more so. But I think we still have a lot of work to do in that department. But yeah, follow Untamed Planet's work, and there's always updates there, and on my Instagram as well. I always post about the projects that we're working on.
And what's your? I'll put them in the show notes. But for a lot of people, they just listen to these things and these podcasts in the car, and they're like, "What's your what is your Instagram name?"
It's my name, Malaika Vaz. So MALAIKAVAZ.
And same for the website.com, is it?
Yes, untamedplanet.in. It's IN. Yeah.
But which documentaries can we actually watch, and where can we watch them? Is it on Nat Geo or?
Well, so I think we did Living with Predators, which was a 3-part series on coexistence, and that was a National Geographic across 90 countries. And I think it should be available on Hotstar and Disney Plus and some of those streaming platforms.
Okay, fantastic.
And then I think Palm New Soil, which was our film about wildlife trafficking, that's also available in some places. And then we've done some non-wildlife documentaries as well, like this film that we produced called Refugees at Home, which was about the migrant crisis and how migrants were impacted during COVID-19. And I think that's available on our website. And the film that we did for Al Jazeera as well about zoonotic diseases, that's available on Al Jazeera's website and their YouTube as well, because right after it went on television, they put it up online.
Okay, fantastic. We're 3 minutes out from the 90 minutes that I said I would keep this podcast under. I've actually still got dozens of questions to ask you, but maybe we do a second one. Or if you've got any plans on coming to Bali anytime in the near future.
We definitely do it. And I want to hear more about the work that you're doing. I've heard, little bits on this podcast, but it sounds super, super impactful and exciting and just really necessary right now. So I'd love to read into it more in the coming weeks and hear more about it in the future.
Absolutely. But look, Bali's going to become I keep telling people it's going to become the green utopia of planet Earth, because we have a governor here who is hell-bent on bringing it back to something of a green utopia with all organic and farming all over the island and restoring the coral reefs and carbon credits and electric vehicles and all of the problems that a developed island like this with tourism is facing. There are solutions and they're underway. So for me, it's really exciting. But you're welcome here anytime. Come and be our guest. Come and see the farm. Come and see our 7 rescued dogs who luckily...
Oh, I love dogs.
Good. Yeah, you have to be.
Dogs,
yeah.
Or domestic dogs, all kinds of dogs.
Bali dogs are semi-wild, they're never really yours. They kind of come and go. You feed them. They give you affection when they want it. You can't really ask for it because they don't really obey that much. My dogs have never been on leads. They live between the farm and the house. And sometimes they're in this podcast room secretly without me knowing, and then they start licking my feet whilst I'm interviewing people, and that's always always a shock. Luckily, not today.
Another camera down there so that you can record
Right. I'm checking now to make sure that there isn't one under there that has sneaked in. Malaika, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. It really has. And I wish you all of the best in your projects. I hope that we cross paths, and thank you for all of your efforts, your attention, your hard work, and also, more importantly, thank you for the risk that you take to get these stories out there, because...
Thank you so much, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Much
Have
needed.
a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you very much.